Welcome to podcast number 15. And as I've mentioned every time, I think this is a spontaneous podcast, something I haven't tried to think out too much because I think it's got to be spontaneous. There's such a lot of things that are so planned that after a while we get sick of the planning. So let's try and see what happens. This podcast, I wanted to think about the art of listening, because it is, of course, the title of our podcast. And one of the things I often ask myself, how does a pianist listen? You could also say, how does a lawyer listen? How does a baby listen? Of course, everyone listens, I think, in a different way. I do think that the way we play, the way we perform, does influence how we listen in sometimes ways that we just cannot imagine, ways that perhaps are difficult to describe even. I think we just listen, and either we are taken with something, we find it interesting, or we sort of start thinking about what shoppings we've got to do, or whatever was bothering us, or whatever we got in our mind. And I think that how do we get an audience really listening? And then I come to several conclusions. One of the first conclusions, I think I even mentioned in my last podcast. In fact, this podcast is a bit of an extension of that last podcast. For instance, how we move on stage is, I think, dreadfully important. Not only at the piano, but how we even come onto the stage is important. The way we are moving, do we move in a jerky way, or is it fluent and just relaxed and easy? I think these things are important, because if it's relaxed and easy, there's a strong chance that we just let the music come. Whereas if we're not relaxed, I think we somehow have closed something off. We're closing an area off which is essential for spontaneous listening. The way of moving, as I mentioned in my last podcast, I think is extremely important. So many things that we are doing which I think put people off. For instance, is the playing looking jerky? Do the hands look smooth? Do they move in a smooth way? You can often see a talented, a pianist, a natural pianist, by the way his hands are moving. If they are moving in ways which are all feeling, well, I would say tense, or even lacking a little bit of ease and relaxation, we sort of feel that. And if we don't feel it, we certainly probably will hear it. It's a little bit like when we're talking to a group of people. Sometimes we notice it goes easy. We can talk easily to people. Whereas other times, for some reason, it's a little harder to make that same feeling. Some conversations just seem to go, whereas other conversations seem to be, well, what is the word? Maybe just static, and sometimes even downright difficult. That you're always trying to think up what to say next. When you've got to think about what to say next, I think something's gone wrong. I think our ideas come from places we don't really understand. And I think that that is something we must give all the openness and freedom to let that happen. So I've even mentioned once to some people, I actually believe that a performance is basically all there before we actually hear it. And I think that somehow it's just a matter of bringing it out of the air, just letting it exist, letting it come by just a few things. if we are overdoing our movements, we're sort of blocking something. So that's a bit of the extension that I mentioned about connecting to the last podcast. But certainly things I feel. I've even noticed, even during competitions, some pianists doing a vibration on the key to try to get the key sounding like a vibrating violin. Crazy things that really obviously don't have much effect on the piano, because unfortunately, or fortunately actually, when we play a note, it's there. The way we do it is going to influence us. Perhaps when we do it in this way, it's a different experience. And that made me think back to my little game I mentioned several podcasts ago. I had this game of actually knowing what piece was going to be played by the first note. For instance, if I would play this note, what piece is it? Can you already tell? I've tried this with different musicians, and sometimes many have actually got exactly the right answer. Maybe you can find the answer if I play two notes. For instance, if I do this. What is it? Well, if I do this, you will know. Just a small thing, but somehow it's already in the first notes. And I'd love the comment once of Pablo Casals, the great cellist. He mentioned once that it's the first note of a piece that he considered perhaps the most important note of the whole piece, because the whole piece is basically incorporated in that one note, especially the way it's being played. Well, of course, we could go on like this. Of course, if I take that same note and I do this, or I do this, well, it's quite obvious. And so on. So it's quite obviously connected to a totally different thing. So you can hear quite a lot already in the way people play the first note. More difficult for a pianist than for a cellist or for perhaps a violinist, because they've got such a strong connection with their instrument. Their instrument is basically almost their own body. So they're actually, like a singer, really able to incorporate a lot in that first note. Whereas we pianists have got a hammer and we've got metal strings. Just imagine the combination. How are you going to make that work and be able to hear a piece in the first notes as a result? Anyway, enough of my little game. It's just a little bit of thing. I often spoke with my students about something which I think is helpful for many pianists, and I've found it very useful, is how we actually this is a piece maybe over here. This is something which gives an indication of what I mean. It is the grosse fugue in a transcription, or actually written by Beethoven himself. He made especially a transcription also for hands. And I'll let you hear a little bit. Just, for instance, goes like this. There are ways of playing that I think make it work better. For instance, when we do this, and go up a little bit, and down, and then up, and then down to that note. So, somehow you get the melodic line better. But if I do it like this, It's almost as though I'm just playing notes. Can you hear it? It's just how I hear that myself. This goes on much further. For instance, when we have this passage, going up, going down for the thumb, going up. Basically, it's going more up generally towards the fifth finger and a little bit down for the thumb. I think that's just one of the choreographies I think I've used many times. And it seems to give us a better idea about how to play the music. There was one wonderful comment from one of my listeners, Adam. He asked about the height of a chair and the way that it can influence the performance. And it's certainly a very good question, because the height of the chair is extremely important. I've often felt that someone is playing with a too high chair or a too low chair. And I think it depends on many things. It of course depends on the actual physical height of a person. How high is the torso? How long are the arms? I think it applies to that also. But a general thing I think we need to think about is generally better to try to be a little lower than higher. Being lower gives us more room, whereas when we are higher and our arms are higher, then we're somehow not able to have that freedom. But on the other hand, if I'm playing Brahms, I would absolutely want a higher chair, because I want the arm weight to be continually put into the note, into the sound. I want it to be a deep sound, a nice, deep, round sound. And to get that, I would have my arms a little higher. I have often been really interested in seeing the old prints, sometimes photos of older pianists. I remember Brahms and Glinka, for instance, the way they held their wrists like this, with a very high wrist, somehow extremely high, even at least you can see that on these prints. Quite interesting to see that they all have that same posture of the wrist, basically quite high. It's an interesting way of trying to play. Try it out, see how it feels, and see if it works. It probably gives you much more sostenuto, more depth in the sound. So that's another point. How high should the wrist be? Well, I would say if we've got a rather low chair, I used to study the Verheul technique. And the Verheul technique uses a very low chair, really much lower than this chair. And the chair is so low that you're really looking up to the keyboard. And that is the clue. With a lower chair, you're somehow playing more upwards. Whereas with the higher chair, you're playing more downwards. And somehow that does have an enormous effect on the pieces we are playing. If we're playing Mozart, I don't think we need to be too much playing downwards. I think that's more upwards. Why? Because it's more delicate, much lighter, and I think the nuances come out better when we're a little bit lower and the hands are higher. So that would be the best way, I think, to play the Mozart. But to play, as I said earlier, Brahms, I would go for the opposite extreme, going a little bit higher with the elbow. So I would choose a chair which is appropriate to the piece I'm going to be playing. Playing Surabji, for instance, I would play with a higher chair. And I've tried it playing with a low chair, but I found that it was much better to play a higher chair. And I think that those things influence that. So thank you very much for that comment. Any comments that anyone likes to make, we're quite happy to have them, and we will certainly try to answer them. Thank you. Well, I don't want to keep on talking about posture and things, but there's another thing that I haven't spoken about, and that's playing forwards. It's sometimes handy to play chords more forwards, because somehow when you do that, they sound better together. Whereas if you do it this way, going down, well, I'm not a very good example because I've been practicing too long in my life. You wouldn't believe it, but it's also true. It's a little harder to get that sounding really completely together. There's another thing that it does. It makes your torso go back, so you get more distance between you and the instrument, which gives you much better. So playing forwards is something I recommend trying out. See how that works. It's usually, I've found, very helpful. It makes your posture even more upright, and I think it goes more out. Arthur Schnabel was one who absolutely insisted on playing forwards. He wanted to do it like this, with the movement of the wrist going upwards. So he would do it that way. And so on. Well, these little things, I think they all have an effect on the long term, how we actually listen to what we're doing. I think that if we don't do things like this, somehow we block our ears and we don't hear what actually happens. We think we hear, but we don't. And I believe that that same feeling comes to the listener very easily like that. Well, that is mainly the main things I wanted to talk about today, and I think they're important things. Please do listen to my next podcast, because it's going to be a very special podcast about the man behind the camera, the man who actually is recording all of these podcasts, Maurice Verheul. He has been absolutely always the one who motivates to doing these podcasts. So please do listen. I'm going to talk about, he's a composer, and I want to explain a little bit about his idea of composition and how he really wants to people to hear his work. But you'll hear that in the next podcast. Thanks again.